Great. Thank you all for joining today. Again, this is an open meeting for applicants or potential applicants for the Barnes Housing Trust Fund's Round 11 grant cycle, which has been opened. It opened on January 16th. It will be closing on February 20th. This application open meeting is intended to cover the application criteria, the scoring matrices, the allocations, general eligibility questions, and then we'll offer time for you all to ask some questions as well, both in the middle and then again at the end. I just ask that you either raise your hand using the hand raise function before asking your question, and then we'll call on you. Until that time, make sure that you remain muted throughout the presentation until you're called on for your question. All right, and with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started here. I'll share my screen, and then for Hannah, Rashida, and Casey, who will also be joining to present some information to you all, I will continue to do the slide deck, so just remind me whenever you want me to change slides. All right, you should be seeing my screen now with the information, and we'll go ahead and get started. So briefly, I just want to introduce everybody. So my name is Ashley Brown. I'm the Housing Trust Fund Manager for the Barnes Fund, and I primarily work on all Barnes Fund activities. You might see me elsewhere within the housing division, but that's my primary role. Rashida, if you would like to introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Rashida Pardue. I'm new to the team with the housing division, and I work with Ashley on the Barnes grant.
Casey.
Hi everyone, I'm Casey Ensign. I started in June and I work as a housing policy research analyst, so I'll be sharing a little bit more about our American Rescue Plan Act programs, but support really all areas of our housing division work. Hannah?
Hey everybody, I'm Hannah Davis. I focus on our policy and new initiatives, and today I'll be speaking on the Innovative Housing Solutions portion of that ARPA funding that will be included in this Barnes round.
Great, thank y'all. And so Rashid is going to start us off by just covering some general eligibility requirements for the Barnes Fund as it applies to both general Barnes funding and the ARPA subsections.
Good afternoon again. So the eligibility project types would include the new construction rental, new construction home buyer, or the owner-occupied rehab. As far as AMI's requirements are concerned, the 60% AMI pertains to the rental projects, and the 80% AMI pertains to the home buyer and the rehab models. As you all know, eligible developers have to be a nonprofit entity unless they are partnering with a nonprofit entity, whereas the nonprofit entity maintains 51% of the partnership. Next slide, please. The zoning needs to be completed before any award money can be paid out. However, rezonings are eligible with the understanding that the Barnes Award cannot preempt or factor into the decision of the Planning Commission. And strong site control is encouraged, and that looks like having a contract or a 99-year deed or anything like that on hand to show site control. Financial standing looks like a positive cash flow, an operating budget equal to or greater than the grant request. For entities that have operational flow over 500,000, an audit is required. For entities with operational budgets between 200,000 and 500,000, would require an external CPA prepared financial. Next slide, please. The affordability term for a project is 30 years for most projects. There is a 5-year forgivable lien for rehab projects with a $5,000 that are over $5,000 per unit. Contract periods for the grant are 24 months unless extended by the Housing Trust Fund Commission and Council. That policy is located in the grant policy document, which we can send to you guys if you don't have it already. The developer fee must be paid. Developer fee paid by Barnes must be equal to or less than 20% of the Barnes request. Next slide. And last but not least, in order to qualify for the grant, you must have a 70-point threshold. And you can see the scoring matrix also in on the policy document that we can send to you if you don't have it already. And next slide.
Oh, great. Thank you, Rashida, for that. That's perfect.
I don't think that included anything with ARPA, but okay.
Yeah, most of that still applies to the ARPA funding as well. A note about the JV structure with the nonprofits. The nonprofit, we do recommend that it is located in Tennessee, but our legal counsel has said that it can be located outside of Tennessee as long as the development is within Davidson County, of course, and then it has to promote the general well-being of Davidson County residents. So there's some ways to interpret that, but that is the general guidance from Metro Legal. Moving on to our funding allocations for this current funding round, we have $13.3 million in our total funding pool. Those requests are capped at $3 million per developer, as has been our policy for a couple of years now. We do, of course, always have our set aside for small organizations. That is 20% of our total allocation. So this is not in addition to, this is part of that total allocation at $2.662 million. If you are applying for the small organization set aside, those funding requests are capped at $750,000. This is intended for organizations who have an operating budget below $2 million to apply for that small organization funding. If that funding is not used in total by the end of the grant round, the commission can then choose to reallocate it to a future grant round or apply the remaining funds to other proposals that applied in the large funding pool that were not able to be funded due to funding allocation. For the ARPA funding pool, we do have an additional $14.7 million in total funding for the ARPA subsection. We'll get into the deeper allocations in just a minute with Casey and Hannah about those subsections, but in total, it's $14.7 million. For those requests, there is no developer cap. The small organization set aside of 20% still does apply to those ARPA subsections as well. Again, we'll cover those in more detail in just a minute as to how much per each of those subsections. So the total funding pool for including ARPA and the operational funding for this funding round is $27 million, and that includes both ARPA funding and the operational funding that is available. For the ARPA small organization subsection, there are the rental housing for older adults. Again, this is 62 years and older. Of the $6.5 million total that is available for that subsection, 1.3 is available for small organizations. For shared housing improvements for older adults 62 and older, 1.2 of that total million set aside for that subsection. $240,000 is set aside, again 20% for those small organizations. And for co-op housing for families, there's a $7 million total allocation for that, and 1.4 is set aside for small organizations. Again, the organization that is applying, if you're applying for the small organization set aside in any of these different subsections, the operating budget has to be below $2 million, and the cap does exist for even the ARPA subsection at $750,000. Although there's no cap per developer for the ARPA subsections, there is a cap for the small organization subsection specifically. For the timeline, as I previously mentioned, the application has already opened. It is currently live. You can go ahead and apply today if you'd like. It's on Momentum Apply. We are only accepting online applications. However, we do have PDF versions of the application available on our website as well, in case you want to look at the questions before actually diving into the application. That is intended for you guys to actually look at the application and start to develop some of that boilerplate narrative before getting into the application itself. However, no paper applications will be accepted and no email applications will be accepted. You have to apply through SurveyMonkey Apply if you would like to be considered. The applications on our website are just for your own personal use. The application will close on February 20th, after which we'll have a short cure period, meaning if there are any attachments left out, if there are things missing from the narrative, as staff is doing their internal review, we can reach out to you guys to cure that before actually going to the external review period. However, of course, make sure that your application is fully submitted and complete before doing that. However, we know small things happen and that's okay. But make sure that that is the only time period in which we will accept any cure to the application. March 1st, we'll actually begin the external review, which our external reviewers will begin reviewing the applications. Again, if you look at the scoring matrix that's available on our website, that'll be linked in the chat. There is a complete delineation between what is scored by staff and what is scored by the external review committee for all of the different subsections and the operational funding. March 28th, the commission will actually vote on awards. And so the commission will take those recommendations from the external funding committee and vote to award the final amounts to the different developers that will be awarded in this round. That, even though they are voting on an award at that time, does not mean that the award is then finalized. It must go to council before it is a final executed contract and award. However, we can provide letters of support after that time. After the commission votes on the final awards, in between March and April, we'll go into a contractual period where we're putting together all of the different items that we'll need in order to go to council, including the final contract. The contracts will then go back to the Housing Trust Fund Commission for a vote. And then once those contracts are approved at the commission meeting, then we'll go and file the legislation for council review at that time. We anticipate a May timeline. However, of course, if you've been through this process before, you know that we also do grant back tax and delinquent tax parcels as part of our grant policy. If you apply for land, please note that it takes longer because those land parcels actually do have to go through a mandatory referral process, which is 30 days. And that we are planning to separate the only financial awards and the awards with property this time around. So we'll plan to have our financial awards go to council, and then we'll have our property awards go at a separate time once mandatory referral is complete. For the attachment requirements, this is an FYI. So as you get into the application process and if you are awarded, so you can know on the front end what you'll need to have in order to be eligible for Barnes funding. In the actual application itself, we of course ask for audits or financials, site plans, architectural plans, construction specifications and work write-ups, budget and pro forma, funding commitments, an affirmative marketing plan. We have an affirmative marketing plan template on our website as well, again, on that same application page with the scoring matrices and the application templates in those. So, and we do have templates for the budget and pro forma as well. Rehab standards are only required for rehab projects or folks that are applying for the shared housing improvements ARPA subsection. We do have 2 optional uploads as well, one for MOUs or memorandums of understanding and letters of partnership. If you are showing more of your partnership structure or more information about community organizations that you'll be working with or letters of support, you can include those here. We also do have an additional upload option for any supporting documentation that would just better your narrative if you want to include more there. Again, those last 2 uploads are optional. You don't have to take that into account when you're developing your narrative, but you're welcome to if you have supporting documentation for those items. If you are awarded and go into the contract period, please be aware that we will ask you for your 501c3 verification letter, your nonprofit charter, your nonprofit bylaws, your procurement policy, your most recent audit. I've included a small note here that if your organization is operationally budgeted between $200,000 and $500,000, we require an independent CPA reviewed financials rather than an audit if you don't have one. Your most recent 990, and then your mission and vision documents.
Very ready.
Okay, I'll go ahead and let Casey take it from here.
Thanks, Ashley. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. I'm just going to give a little overview about the American Rescue Plan Act. I'll give some really high-level overview on all of the programs that our division will be administering, but we'll do a deeper dive today on the programs that are flowing through the Barnes Fund. So just kind of some general information about the American Rescue Plan Act. It was part of the coronavirus state and local fiscal recovery funds program that delivered over $350 billion to state, local, and tribal governments across the country. And Nashville received around $259.8 million of this allocation. What Metro did was they formed a COVID-19 financial oversight committee that was really responsible for reviewing any proposals on how those funds should be used and ultimately making recommendations to council. Next slide. And probably no surprise to you all, but back in 2022, the COVID-19 Financial Oversight Committee launched a community survey to get a sense of what the community really wanted to prioritize these funds to do. And again, no surprise here, but affordable housing was one of the top priorities that really came out of those survey results. So what the COVID-19 Financial Oversight Committee did in year one was allocate around $55 million of ARPA towards affordable housing initiatives that included the Barnes Fund and also the Catalyst Fund. And then in year two, Mayor Cooper made a request that an additional $30 million be earmarked for affordable housing initiatives and also an additional $50 million be invested in helping address homelessness. I won't touch on those $50 million that's focused on homelessness. Our division's not administering those funds, but definitely happy to share offline if you're interested in learning more about that. Next slide. And so this just gives an overview of the timeline. What our division did was to help draft the proposals that we wanted to bring to the COVID-19 Financial Oversight Committee. We actually convened stakeholder work groups on really three main areas. One area was focused on housing for older adults. One area was focused on really addressing homeownership inequities with a specific focus on increasing homeownership rates for Black and Brown households. And then the third bucket was really just about being innovative. So we were calling that innovative housing solutions. And we ultimately landed on really focusing on families. So through that process, we came up with some concrete activities that we'll share a little bit more here in just a second. We went back to the COVID-19 Financial Oversight Committee in August with our proposals. They had some questions. We came back to them in October, and ultimately our proposals were reviewed and approved by committees and councils in November of 2022. And now we're in the implementation phase. One thing to note with this funding is that it does have to be expended by December 31st, 2026. That's a hard deadline. It's use it or lose it money, which is one of the reasons we were really excited that some of our activities could flow through the Barnes Fund since this is such a great program that's already well baked. So definitely going to share a lot more information about those programs. Next slide. And just some things that I think is really important to remember, especially when you're applying, what our division was really prioritizing in drafting and creating these programs. We know this is one-time funding. We wanted to use it to be helping systems change, being innovative, being bold, putting out programs that we don't necessarily have existing resources and funding to support, but really trying to do something new that could ultimately address some of the long-term standing housing inequities that our community is facing. Next slide. So here you can see those different buckets of funding that I had just mentioned. Of note, in addition to those three that are in blue, those are the three programs that we as a division will be overseeing, but also an additional $5 million went to Envision Casey, which MDHA is responsible for. Next slide. So here I'll just give a really, again, high-level overview of all of our ARPA programs, but the ones that are have blue text on this slide, those are the ones that will be flowing through this upcoming or current Barnes Fund round. So $10 million will be going to what we call Pathways to Equitable Homeownership. We have two main activities that will be falling under that bucket. The first primary activity will be building new construction or acquisition and rehab of housing with a focus on shared equity. We, as a stakeholder work group, came together, and shared equity was really something that the community was really interested in pursuing. So we're really excited about what opportunities might come out of that. And an additional $500,000 will go to a nonprofit or a consortium of nonprofits who will be focused on increasing awareness of and connection to existing resources for prospective home buyers. And they'll also be tasked with spreading awareness about what shared equity is. Both of those will be going through a separate RFP process. I'm not going to answer questions about those today. There'll be time much or later, not too much later down the road, since we are on a timeline here, but in a few months, we'll have more information to share about those particular activities. Under the Housing Opportunities for Older Adults bucket, the two main programs that will be flowing through the Barnes Fund is first, rental housing for 62 and older. $6.5 million will be going towards that. $1.2 million will be going towards shared housing improvements. And then we also have $300,000 that will be used to launch a tech-enabled home sharing pilot. And what a home sharing program is it connects a senior homeowner with a prospective tenant. And the main purposes really behind home sharing is to provide some passive income for that senior homeowner who may be at risk of housing insecurity. And there's also tons of benefits around just improving social isolation, social connection, and just making sure that that senior homeowner, is really kind of getting integrated into the community, and also having that opportunity, again, at kind of intergenerational connection. And last but not least is the Innovative Housing Solutions. $7 million will be going towards that. And Hannah will be speaking more on that activity, but we will be focused on co-op housing for families. Next slide. So just doing a little bit of a deeper dive of all those programs that will be flowing through the Barnes Fund. The first being the Housing Opportunities for Older Adults. This is really comparable to other projects that the Barnes Fund has funded in the past. It will fund new construction or acquisition and rehab of housing for rent. The residents must be 62 or older and at or below 60% of the area median income. As Rashida and Ashley mentioned earlier, all the Barnes general funding requirements will apply, and all the Barnes rental requirements will also apply. The big thing to note that is a difference is that there is no funding cap per developer for any of these ARPA projects that are flowing through the Barnes Fund. Next slide. So Housing Opportunities for Older Adults, the Shared Housing Improvements Program, $1.2 million will be used for this particular activity that will be focused on funding repairs or improvements to create an additional living space. And this can include also developing an attached accessory dwelling unit, or even potentially a conversion of an existing garage for a detached accessory dwelling unit. This funding has to be used for one of three purposes. One, to enable a space of the home to be rented through the home sharing program, to create a safe space for on-site care, or to accommodate for multi-generational housing. And what our primary objectives with this program was, and kind of how it differentiates from other rehab and repair programs that is currently flowing through Barnes, it's really about creating additional living space within a senior's home. And again, kind of going back to some of that conversation about the home sharing program, since we've seen so many benefits on senior homeowners having not only that opportunity for passive income, but also just that opportunity for social connection. So that's kind of where we were, our thought process was in developing this particular program. And also the hope is to provide additional affordable housing opportunities within the home as well. Next slide. And so some requirements around this particular program, again, the rest.
Hold on, let me mute myself.
Okay, yeah, I'll keep going. So residents served must be 62 years of age and older, and homeowners must be earning at or below 80% of the area median income. And due to federal requirements around new construction, new detached accessory dwelling units is not an eligible expense. As I just mentioned earlier, if a household does have a current, detached garage as part of their home, you could convert that into an ADU. Of course, you'd have to go through the proper zoning and permitting requirements, but that would be eligible. However, just really underscoring here that new development would not be an eligible expense, since it would trigger some restrictions that would be very difficult for homeowners to be able to comply with. An investment per unit should not exceed $40,000. And our general target here was that we would assist around 50 homeowners. And this is not necessarily a baked goal, but we did want to kind of go ahead and think about what the impact might be with this funding. Next slide. And again, similar to all the other ARPA programs that you'll see, all of Barnes general funding requirements will apply. All the Barnes rehab funding requirements will apply. But the big change is that no funding cap will apply for these ARPA programs. And just some things that we'll be looking at in applications specific for the shared housing improvements is that applicants have a demonstrated experience serving older adults. They have an experience or partnering with someone who does have experience with creating additional living spaces, such as an attached dwelling unit or attached accessory dwelling unit within existing homes. And then also we're looking for this applicant to have some outreach plans on how they plan to coordinate with the home sharing program once that program is up and established. And I think I should pass it off to Hannah now.
Great. Hello, everybody. So really excited about this program bucket, and thanks to folks on this call who were part of the group this summer that helped craft what this funding was able to become. So we have $7 million, and it will be used to create housing security for at-risk families through the development of a replicable cooperative housing model. And so really want to highlight there the two objectives. Obviously, the primary objective is housing security for at-risk families, primarily at or below 50% AMI. And, while we can't say explicitly only folks with school-age children, because that can get a bit tricky since folks can have a school-age child move out of the home and we don't want them to lose their housing, et cetera. The goal there is really trying to address the increase in the unhoused population that has children in MNPS. And I'm sure everyone on this call has heard about that increase. We know all the incredibly important outcomes that are rooted in housing security for our school-age children and our families. So we would love to see a proposal that focuses on that housing security. And we want to bridge the gap between rental and traditional homeownership, both of which are incredibly important. But as we know, the leap from getting into traditional homeownership is becoming a chasm that is too large for a lot of our families. And so from research and great perspectives added through the working group this summer, the cooperative housing model rose to the surface as a model to explore and pursue in order to be able to create that housing security for families, but with a much lower buy-in cost. And then secondly, we want to build and scale the local housing cooperative system. That's not necessarily the primary, that's why it's listed second, but it is something, we want to be able to prove the concept here, because we know while this funding is targeted to create a little bit over 100 units, we know the need is so much greater. And so rather than, just pay for folks to come in and kind of show, here's how you do it and then leave, we want to build really lasting, strong relationships with groups that have expertise in this, and then hopefully be able to prove this concept. And, I'm sure there will be learnings along the way for how this fits in our local context, but really create a scalable model so that households throughout Davidson County are able to create housing security without, having to only pursue traditional homeownership. Next slide. So what you'll see as you look at the application for innovative housing solutions is, similarly to the program Casey discussed, all Barnes general funding requirements still apply. There is no funding cap per developer, and that's intentional. As I spoke with partners across the country and did research, what we're pursuing here is innovative, which could be code for really challenging. And that's why we're taking this on. We don't want to just pursue low-hanging fruit, but we do know that this can be an expensive model because we're trying to kind of, get to achieve two housing purposes. We are looking for the kind of scale that we tend to see at the rental housing, in the rental housing model, but we want some increased housing security. And so what you see typically is, a share that each household purchases into. I'm not going to review, the entire context of housing cooperatives here, but we know that we're kind of looking at almost down payment assistance at a lower price tag, in addition to the development costs. And additionally, while there are some federal funds that can be used for this purpose, we know that with the expedited delivery timeline and the fact that this is not a model that's really widely used here, that those funds, though they can be programmed that way, are not currently always programmed that way. So you'll see in the application, while we want to make sure that these dollars are stretched as far as possible, we know that there might be a greater percentage of Barnes funding in these applications than potentially like a tax credit deal, for example. So that's why there's no funding cap per developer, though we will, fund as many proposals as possible, as long as they meet the criteria of being able to deliver a top quality product in service of our families on that delivery timeline. So take that into consideration. If you're looking to apply, you want to certainly be competitive, but realistic about your ability to deliver. And so that's why you'll see the next consideration, partnerships are highly encouraged. Again, this is a complex model and it's a challenging model, and it's on a 3-year timeline. And so while, of course, Barnes applications and contracts are typically 24 months, we have local control over that. So we're able to, discuss with the commission and council when there's delays. That will not be the case here unless folks have an in at HUD or the Fed that I don't know about. So that's, we're looking for expenditures by the end of 26. And so, while you could decide to apply alone and, kind of toss your hat in the ring, certainly from everything that I've researched, many hands make this complex and challenging model easier to digest. And then, of course, as we look to build a system here, the more folks that are involved in the partnership, the more potentially we can expand that local capacity. The target unit creation, this was set by the back and approved by councils, 108, that was using some of our calculations. Obviously, in this market, those are based on old numbers, but still, of course, that's what we'll be reporting to council based on in terms of our accountability for these funds. And then to be clear, the funding can be used for conversion of existing naturally occurring affordable housing, but any direct subsidy should only and can only qualify for families at or below 50% AMI. You know, obviously, if we're talking about funding, like the administration fee, the legal services could potentially apply to the entire complex. And so that, you know, we're not going to get totally down to the penny on whether the legal services, et cetera, that help set up the cooperative are only available. But we only want to see any direct subsidy going to our most at-risk families. And the housing that will be counted towards that 108 is the families at or below 50% AMI. That's our top priority with this funding. The contract will require additional progress reports and milestones beyond a traditional development contract. Again, that's because this isn't just about the sticks and bricks. This is about the legal structure, the financial structure, the ability to bring on additional funding. So while, you know, the city wants to be a partner with, you know, whoever's selected or whatever partners are selected and applicants are approved, we will want to make sure that we're, you know, an ongoing partner so that we can help this succeed for the betterment of the city. And then you'll see the eligibility are not prescriptive. There's many different ways that you can craft a housing cooperative. While I think the limited equity cooperative is the predominant model for affordable housing, you know, there's already many market dynamics that applicants will be dealing with in order to be able to deliver this product. And so we were cautious not to be overly prescriptive. We will be looking at applications that can deliver on the priorities and the goals. And so encourage applicants to be creative, ambitious, and of course, innovative, since that's the title of the program. You know, but really you'll see in the application, we want to see commitments with partners. We want to see the applicants have thought through how this will be done, rather than, you know, the funding being given out and then, you know, potentially the partner just kind of begins thinking about it. Those will not be considered competitive proposals based on the scoring matrix. Next slide. That's all.
Great. Before we get into the questions about this section, as a reminder, the ARPA funding is considered to fund net new units, meaning if you have received a Barnes funding award prior to this for a specific development and it is not eligible to apply for additional ARPA funding. These are net new projects, net new units. So it has to be a completely separate proposal from anything that has been funded previously. Additionally, and we'll mention this again later on in the presentation, but if you are applying for, you may apply for both subsections, operational funding and for ARPA funding, but they can only be for separate projects. You cannot double dip in the same project within the same funding round. Again, this is intended to create net new units on both sides, not necessarily use funding from both general funding availability and ARPA for one single development. And in terms of questions, I'll go ahead and call on folks with their hands raised using the hand raise button, and then I'll call on anybody with a phone number if you've called in afterward. So I'll go ahead and start with Eddie since he's had his hand up the longest. Eddie, if you want to ask your question.
Yeah, thank you, Ashley. This is very helpful. Thank you. Are you going to send us a copy of this PowerPoint after you do next week's session or not?
Yes, it will be online for folks to see. Okay,
we can get online. Okay, it's just really helpful. And then number two, something we got in writing said that we had to have zoning in order for the land in order to apply. But if we're applying for lots, I mean, this is an assumption, I don't want to make it. That will be an exception, is that correct? Because there's no way we can get zoning on land we don't own.
Yep, I am totally understanding of that. Zoning, strong site control is encouraged. Again, zoning is not an absolute eligibility requirement. You can still apply if you're in the zoning process, again, with the understanding that funding cannot be pulled down until zoning is acquired by and through council and the planning commission. As well as we can't interfere or preempt any decision on the behalf of the planning commission or council about zoning. So Barnes funding cannot have a place in any of your arguments to get your zoning if you were awarded without zoning. And For the back tax lots specifically, that is a completely separate issue from this zoning requirement and is noted as such in the actual scoring matrix. It notes that a strong site control includes applying for a delinquent tax lot through Metro.
All right, thanks. That's very clear. I'm done.
Great. All right, Lucille.
Yes, thank you. Yes, I think it's very helpful. I also had a question about the back tax lots. On something that I had seen a number of weeks ago, I had seen a couple of properties I thought that were on Brick Church Pike, sizable properties, that were adjacent. And when I looked at the most recent list, I did not see those properties on the list. So I wanted to know, was I missing something or had those been removed?
No, our property list is up to date. Of course, as most folks here know, Metro is undergoing a completely Metro-wide review of all of Metro-owned properties right now. And so until that study concludes and there are absolute findings from that, as well as recommendations for what would be feasible and attainable for the housing division to acquire and utilize for not only the Barnes funding, but also other projects and RFPs that we plan to put out in the future, we won't have anything other than what's available in that list. So right now that list is kind of the end all be all. Not that there won't be more to come, but there is a lot of other work happening in the background that we don't necessarily have control over until that project concludes.
Okay, so the list, so it seemed like there was a prior list, but the list that is on the website now is final.
Yes.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right, any questions from the folks on the phones? All right, great. We'll go ahead and move on then since oh, Brian, you have a question before we move on? Brian, did you in turn to raise your hand? Okay, since I can't hear you, I'll move on to John. Did you have a question?
Yeah, thanks. Two questions. Is this the only funding round for the Barnes funding in this calendar year? And you mentioned that site plans, architectural plans, and construction specs are required as part of the application. What's the level of detail on those architectural plans and construction specs? Thanks.
Great question. The level of detail is scored. So although those documents are required, they will be scored based on the level of specificity going all the way up to construction level documents. So we will score absolute 100% of points on construction level documents and then work our way down from there. All of that is explicitly weighed out in the actual scoring matrix itself, which is again available on our website, and I'll cover that in just a second. For the calendar year question, the short answer is we don't know until the budget is passed. So unfortunately, while we typically anticipate a full round, we cannot speculate or anticipate actually putting out another funding round in the fall until that is completed, and the budget cycle we won't know for sure until July 1. So more information to come. We typically do put out a second round. This is actually our third round that we're putting out in any given rolling 12-month period. So we've been pretty good about putting money out as fast as we get it. We just have to be able to talk about it eloquently, and that it will be up to the council about when we know what our budget will be. So to be determined on that one. Great. Lucille, did you have another question or did you want me to lower your hand?
No, I did. I just had one more question, which is, do you have a definition of unhoused? That comes up in the documents, and we've heard a couple of different definitions, and we wanted to be sure we answered the question properly.
Sure. After this meeting, Casey can share the definition of unhoused with you, and we'll be pulling from the guidance from HUD on that one, since these are federal funded dollars and the unhoused section specifically applies to that.
Great. Thank you.
Great. Brian, I'll give you another opportunity to.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, so does the management agent identified in the affirmative fair housing marketing plan have to be the eventual agent of record, or can it be any licensed property manager?
I don't know the answer to that question off the top of my head, unless you do, Hannah, since you went through this with pilot.
For the pilot, it did not have to be the one that we finally went with, I don't believe. Brian, I can get back to you on that, but kind of similar to some other questions, we want to see a level of thoughtfulness and that the applicants are prepared to have identified a property manager and are, displaying thoughtfulness about how affirmative marketing and fair housing would be implemented.
Okay, thank you.
All right, perfect. We're going to move on. It looks like we will actually run over on time. I hope that you can stay. If you can't, again, this will be recorded and will be posted at some point in the future after our meeting on Monday. I'll go ahead and lengthen our meeting for Monday as well, since we've already run over on time on this one, so that way we can better budget our time for next session. Elizabeth, did you have one question before we move on?
Yes, thank you so much. In the matrix, you talk about the level of qualifications that your developing team needs, and you mentioned the phrase similar housing. Is there any guidelines for what is similar housing?
And I think it would just be similar housing to the proposal that you are actually submitting. So if you're doing rental housing, similar housing would be other rental housing. If you're doing home buyer options, it would be other home buyer housing options. So that would be the guidance on that.
Awesome, thank you.
Perfect. All right, we'll go ahead and move on. For an overview of the scoring matrices, the bonus points for round 11 are around diversity, equity, affordability, and inclusion. Again, these are all ranked by the amount of points awarded for any of these specific subsections. 5 points up to 5 points can be awarded for the DEAI bonus point section. Deeply affordable housing, again, also 5 bonus points up to, and that is based on the depth of AMI that you're able to incorporate within your proposal. This is all spelled out again in the scoring matrix. Healthy communities and sustainability and resiliency are both new categories to our bonus points, and those are worth up to 4 points each. And then the UZO, or the urban zoning overlay, and then disaster zones are also 2 points, up to 2 points apiece. Disaster zones won't actually apply to almost any application in this current funding round. However, the commission decided to keep it in there for a virtue signal to anyone in the future as we move forward in other funding cycles should another natural disaster happen. The urban zoning overlay, while not necessarily net new to the Barnes Fund, it used to be its own subsection of funding, but this is the first year that it's actually incorporated into the bonus points rather than its own subsection. So that's why it's labeled as new. Again, up to 2 points on UZO and disaster zones if that were applicable in this round. There is an internal and an external review in the scoring matrix. You'll see outlined in either of those sections which ones will be scored by staff and which will be scored by external, and that goes for all of the different subsections with different scoring matrices. For rental and homeowner changes, the internal review items that we have changed since our last funding round include changes to incorporate a mix of different multiple team members that might have different levels of experience rather than just one team member with a lot of experience, which has been scored on in the past. Outreach, we have added an affirmative marketing plan, and then resident recruitment and the methodology behind that, as it was not included in our last one. And then site control, again, like I mentioned to Eddie a few minutes ago, changes were made to incorporate back tax lots as full points, since they are technically Metro owned and would be conveyed if they were awarded. External review changes include the design changes. So design was originally a bonus point section, but has moved up into our threshold criteria and incorporates all those different construction specification documents and architectural plans and those such. And then there is a tiered system to how those are scored, also incorporated in the scoring matrix. It also incorporates overall design of the development and home buyer options for both the homeowner and the rental application. And then the home buyer education and tenant selection, we included resale information about the deeds of restricted covenant, and how the developer will keep in contact with those homes that are sold in order to assist home buyers in the resale process should they sell the home. And then for rental, we added resident feedback processes and leasing policies as part of the threshold criteria as well. For rehab changes, we again changed the team experience and outreach, which is the same. And then external review changes included education and affordability around the lien education, the warranty education, and general home upkeep information to assist the homeowner further down the line should they continue to remain in the home after the rehab. I'll go ahead and hand off to Casey.
Thanks, Ashley. And I'll just highlight a couple things here. Again, the shared housing improvements will have a separate application. This application was created using the template for barns, but there are a couple of different areas that we'll be looking at specifically for this. Again, focusing on team experience, we'll be looking for applicants to demonstrate that they have experience serving the older adult population. We'll also be looking at applicants either have direct experience or are partnering with organizations who have experience developing ADUs. Given that this program is really geared towards creating additional living space, we want to make sure that these improvements that are being made are designed thoughtfully and intentionally, and are really create a space that someone would be excited to live in. Also, there'll be some changes around the developer or administration fee that will be scored slightly differently than in the Barnes Fund. I would encourage you to kind of look closely at that. The score provides a little bit more flexibility for applicants to go up to that full 20% if needed. And this was a flexibility that we wanted to be able to provide in the case that an applicant wants to partner with, say, a design agency, just give you, again, some more flexibility with being able to put forth the best proposal possible. We'll be looking at intentional outreach efforts specific to older adults, and then also really intentional efforts to reach diverse populations within that older adult population. Some things that we'll be looking at under the program approach. Again, we want some information on how these improvements would be different than just kind of more minimal home rehab or repairs. We want to know how the applicant plans to engage the homeowner in the process. And then lastly, on the education and affordability piece, since one of the purposes for the shared housing improvements is to enable a homeowner to be part of the home sharing program, we want to see how the applicant would propose to really educate prospective homeowners about this program that will be being rolled out hopefully in the next several months. So that's just a little bit high level, again, information about the shared housing improvements. Definitely encourage you to look closely at the scoring matrices. Again, it was used based off of the Barnes template, but we made some tweaks to make sure that it was specific to this particular program. And Hannah, I'll pass it off to you.
Great. So for team experience, again, we'll be looking for experience creating and maintaining housing cooperatives that create long-term housing affordability. So not just, again, the development of that single building, but the system of the creation of that system, the cooperative model that will sustain the housing security long-term. Again, similar to Casey's, the developer administration fee is scored a bit differently than the traditional Barnes Fund, as the model focuses not just on the development, but on the system and the supportive expertise. So we want to make sure that partnerships, are locked in contracts as much as possible, and that any fees associated with those consultancies or partnerships are incorporated into the proposal. The outreach, we want to see the opportunity for engagement with existing at-risk communities in naturally occurring affordable housing. Again, what you'll see as you, if you already know or familiarize yourself with the model, is it's often used in the conversion of existing housing And so places where we see naturally occurring affordable housing, especially in places where there's potentially already a community built up in that, in the physical building, that there's been an informal community created there. What are the ways that we can use this tool to preserve that community and build some structure around it to ensure the long-term housing security? Again, in the legislative environment in which we exist, we don't have the ability to put a lot of protections around that. So this is a chance to be able to address some of those sales that we see of that naturally occurring housing. But the proposal is open to new construction if that's, again, all that's available or the most prudent path that the applicant identifies. And we'll want to see potential efforts to reach families at or below 50% AMI. The program approach will be screening for strong proposals that will showcase clear research and understanding of this market and the ability to deliver. Again, back to, is new construction really the best option in this timeline and with the complexity, or have there already been buildings or apartment complexes identified and contracts secured? We'll want to see that level of thoughtfulness. And then we'll want to see a plan for long-term affordability and then long-term sustainability of the housing cooperative. And for education and affordability, there'll be a strong focus on education and creation of housing cooperatives. And again, ideally limited equity cooperatives, though we didn't want to be overly prescriptive.
Great. We have entered another question period. So this is more related to the actual scoring matrices. If you haven't had the opportunity to look at those scoring matrices and you want to join our next meeting that's on Monday with some more developed questions about the scoring matrices specifically, those all are available on our website for you all to review as a reference material. Right now, we are not accepting any personal meetings or phone calls from developers or potential applicants outside of our existing grantees about existing contracts. However, I am able to answer some questions in writing only, so please send those to me specifically. My email address is listed here. If you send me an email, please copy Rashida on that email as well, since we work together. And then I will triage your email to Casey or Hannah if you have specific questions about either of the subsections for ARPA. And then we'll go to our questions. So if anybody has a question, please use the raise your hand function. And after we address all of those questions, we'll ask our folks on the phone if they have any as well. Any questions? Okay, perfect. Seeing none from the folks in the audience, any folks on the phone, if you have any questions, now would be a time to ask. Okay, well, seeing no questions, we'll go ahead and end our meeting here miraculously on time. So patting myself on the back on that. And also thanks to Hannah and Rashida and Casey as well for putting so much effort into this. We're really excited to turn this money around quickly. As you saw, we just got awarded it in November. We're already putting it out into some barns rounds. So exciting movement forward on that. And I will see you all either at a commission meeting in the future or on Monday's meeting. If you have any questions in the meantime, again, email is the only way to have those questions specific about applications answered at this time. You can email me, copy Rashida on that, and then depending on what your question is, we might forward you on to Hannah or Casey. Thank you so much for joining. I'll go ahead and end the recording here and hope you have a great rest of your weekend.